Bill the Fountain, Ed Clark, and Art Friedman. Art Friedman's remains are in our backyard, and they will have a lot to do with my sermon today. Our opening words are taken from one of Reverend Tom's books of pithy sayings. What is done with dead people? It would be mean and contemptible to cast them into the ground or the fire without a backward glance, as if they were some leaf falling off an autumn tree. The famous anthropologist Franz Boas once asked a primitive African bushman who he was studying why the bushman buried and stayed near a dead relative. The man answered, "He is our person whom we loved." Modern civilization has no better answer. I would now like to invite you to join us in singing our opening hymn. Joanne Allen is going to assist us because these are hymns out of the gray hymnal that are not that frequently sung. It is not a solo, she is just helping. I'm going to imitate Reverend Tom and start with, "Good morning, I'm glad you're here." Since I'm going to talk about a religious subject, I need to start by letting you know what I believe. I'm an agnostic humanist. I do not declare myself to be an atheist, only because, as a matter of logic for a lawyer, you cannot prove a negative statement. I believe that Marx was right about 19th century Christianity being a form of false consciousness. I also believe that Freud's pronouncement that religion is a mild form of mental illness called a neurosis is correct. Finally, I believe that Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God in 1893 Europe was correct. We are an educated crowd. Probably everyone here today has been to a lot of museums. As you know, that much of what is known about ancient civilizations from around the world is based on artifacts found in graves. My sermon today is limited to my field of expertise, which is the legal systems of Western civilization, Europe and North America. So I'm not being discriminatory when I leave out the rest of the planet, okay? During the Neolithic period in Europe, roughly 4,000 to 3,000 BC, the big event was the expansion of agricultural society. As farming communities grew, they developed the practice of building burial mounds. Agnes and I spent 2 weeks in Denmark this year, and Denmark is covered with these burial grounds. There's nothing special about them. Archaeologists have documented about 20,000. The reason for that is every little clan only had a few square miles that was their territory, and every single extended family group built their own burial mound. So I've got some pictures to illustrate part one of my sermon, and I emphasize this is not photo art, these are my pictures. This is a typical burial mound dated to 3,700 BC. Now we are going to advance the slides and go into it. No, that's not 2 and 3. Keep going. Keep going. There it is. Nothing special, no gate in front of it, no locks. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going, and stop. The Neolithic people who built that burial mound selected the granite erratic boulders left over from the glaciers that had mica in them to give the reflection that you saw from my camera flash. So you've now been in a 3,500 BC burial mound. Would you call that a religious experience? Yes or no? If not, why not? Okay, I need 7, which is the Rhine River cruise. Most of you have probably taken the Rhine River cruise. This is one of the oldest cemeteries in Europe that's right on the cruise. It's been continuously used since 5,000 BC. The interesting fact of this one is cemetery sites tend to get reused as styles of burial change. There's something in the human psyche that people go to the same place where other dead bodies are and add them. This particular cemetery has 7 different types of burials in the same area, basically stacked one on top of each other. Okay, this service and sermon is about death, not cemetery, so I want you to lighten up, okay? Don't take this too seriously. Okay, we're now going to come to the United States. The Woodland Indian period, they're all around here. There's Winfield mounds right up in Winfield, Illinois, where I live. The Woodland period Indians from about 500 BC to 1000 AD also built burial mounds. Why they are similar to the ones in Denmark? Nobody knows for sure. They didn't have the rocks, but they did the very same thing. Put bodies in the ground, added dirt, put more bodies in the ground, added dirt, and these are Woodland Indian burial mounds right here. Okay, this is a rural or garden type cemetery. The history of cemeteries is fascinating. There's an enormous amount of literature written about it, landscape architecture, the theology, the religion. So the Christian background is straightforward. The earliest Christians inherited from their Jewish ancestors the Semitic custom of inhumation. That's the technical term for burying somebody in the ground. In contrast, the Greeks and Romans cremated their dead bodies. The early Christians rejected cremation because they believed in the resurrection of the dead at Judgment Day, which was going to be the reunification of the soul and the glorified body in the second coming of Christ. Hence, for 2,000 years up to today, in Europe and the US, Most people who are Catholic and most people who are mainline Protestants do not believe in cremation. Until very recently, that was a rigid position. Times are changing, and I'm going to talk about that in the second part of this sermon. Give me 13, which is LBJ Cemetery. Now, this may look like a cemetery to you. It happens to be the family burial plot for President LBJ and his family. But it's not a cemetery. Why? Private cemeteries don't meet the legal definition of what a cemetery is, but it is documented that there are tens of thousands of private burial grounds like this throughout the United States and Europe. This is a family cemetery plot containing 5 generations of Agnes's ancestors. This provides a sense of place and connection for the descendants living in the area now. Okay, I want you to lighten up again. Go to slide 17. This is what is called the Garden Cemetery. In 1843, a landscape architect named Collins wrote a book about the creation, maintenance, and proper care of cemeteries, which became, pun intended, the Bible for cemeteries. And in the 19th century, we've got Adam Smith's invisible hand at work for sure. As the country expanded, it just became impossible for new churches to buy enough land in urban areas to be able to continue the tradition of the church graveyard, the church cemetery. So the social response was these large public cemeteries, and to make them more acceptable to the population, they were landscaped to be like pretty parks. And just happens to be that's my car, and that's where all my family in Cleveland, Ohio is buried. 18. Not all cemeteries are above ground. This is the underground cemetery for 55,000 soldiers killed in the Spanish Civil War. It's also Franco's mausoleum. This one is one of the most unique cemeteries I've ever seen. It is for deceased men and women who died in the Vietnam War. The gnomon up there, that's okay, the gnomon up there casts the shadow, and engraved on the base is a granite plaque for every single person who died in the Vietnam War, and it's coordinated with the celestial coordinates, so as the shadow of the day moves, it shines on the name of the person who died. Just amazing. Okay, now we're going to go through these very quickly. These are pictures from Danish cemeteries just taken a few months ago when we were in Denmark. These are some of the most beautiful, decorated, maintained cemeteries I have ever seen. Finally, I'm a Vietnam War veteran, and a lot of people don't realize that there are 147 military cemeteries in the United States. And a lot of people haven't been to one. When you see these pictures, every single white tombstone is a body. As I was taking these pictures, this deer came along, and before leaving the cemetery, I discovered that people were feeding the deer in the cemetery as a hobby, and literally, this deer was 2 feet away from me wanting an Oreo cookie. Okay. I'm going to take a break before I do part 2, and I would ask you to join us in responsive reading number 720, and stand if you are able. In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember them. In the going of the wind and in the show of the earth, we remember them. In the opening of buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the blueness of the sky and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. In the rustling of leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. Thank you. Okay, as you can tell from your order of service, the next thing I've inserted is a guided meditation called A Walk in a Cemetery. I would invite you to close your eyes. Be aware of your feet, which are warm and heavy. Be aware of your hands, which are warm and heavy. Be aware of your breathing, which should be slow and steady. You are walking into a cemetery. A cemetery you might have been to before. If you've never been to a cemetery, I invite you to think of one of the pictures I have shown. You are carrying flowers. You are going to a grave. Whose is it? Can you see it there in front of you? Are you happily remembering that person? Are you sadly remembering that person? It's a beautiful, warm spring day. There are no bugs. The sky is blue. And you sit down and think and remember. You fall asleep. You wake up and it's dark. You've fallen asleep in a cemetery. Is it kind of uncomfortable? You remember some old stupid horror movie you saw as a kid? You remember going into a cemetery in those wild days of high school and drinking beer with your friends and making fun of it. Suddenly you aren't very comfortable. You calmly get up, walk back to your car, and wonder if you've had a spiritual experience. I invite you to reopen your eyes and rejoin me for our next musical interlude. Part one of today's sermon was background information for you in the form of history. Part two is going to be advocacy, me advancing an idea for your consideration. I'm going to start with some American history. The Pilgrims arrived in 1620. They are theologically classified as a separatist group because they rebelled against the Church of England. The Puritans arrived 10 years later. They are theologically classified as a reformist group. They did not reject the teachings of the Church of England, they just wanted to reform the ritual practices. What did the American Revolution do from the legal perspective? Since Christianity was introduced in England, the authority regarding human remains was the exclusive legal providence of the Anglican Church, which was the one and only authorized, legally recognized religious institution in the country. So the law of burial places in England at the time of our Revolution was largely contained in ecclesiastical or canon law. The Church's authority over human remains, particularly after internment, was justified based upon both on theology. The Church was the spiritual garden of human remains until the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the dead, and practical considerations because the Church owned the consecrated real estate in which people were buried. So, three fundamental legal assumptions supported English law concerning the operation, management, and control of cemeteries. The first was the existence of one established Christian church. The second was ownership by that church of all burial places, controlled. Title was paramount. You owned the ground, you owned what was in it, including dead bodies. And the adoption of canon law over civil law. The English civil courts didn't have jurisdiction over what happened in cemeteries. So, after the American Revolution, when we did away with organized state religion, from the legal perspective, when problems came up concerning cemeteries, nobody knew what to do literally. They didn't know what the rules were. What happens if the state of Pennsylvania wants to put a new corduroy, that's a log road, through part of a cemetery? Churches die, they prosper, they end. What happens with the bodies when the church no longer exists as a functioning social institution? Or update to just very recently, when the latest O'Hare runway expansion was done, there were 3 cemeteries in the middle of the new runway that had to be dealt with. So when these issues came up, the courts developed a common law, which was eventually codified into various state statutes. The result was 4 principles of American law on cemeteries. The first principle is that human remains, places of internment and entombment, and memorials to the dead are sacred and should be protected, regardless of what religion is involved. The second principle of the common law of burial places says that real property used for burial or entombment purposes shall be perpetually dedicated to that use. So the American social norm was, once you had a grave and used it, it was your grave. In contrast, the European tradition was the catacombs. For example, in Paris, there's about 6 million sets of bones in the catacombs of Paris, because in Europe, after the body decayed, the bones were dug up, put in the catacomb, and the grave was reused again and again and again. The third principle of U.S. common law of burial places is that human remains, once interred, shall not be disturbed. The fourth principle contradicts the first 3, which is problems always come up. That's what causes society to churn. So when these things happen, somebody starts a lawsuit, goes to court, and the court decides. Does O'Hare get to dig up all the dead bodies because it's more important to put in a new runway? Or should you leave those bodies there and put the runway somewhere else? The court decided, obviously, there's a new runway because that's why we hear more airplanes here today. Today, there are 61 cemeteries in DuPage County and 14,368 in Illinois. Could we have one on our land right here? The practical answer is no. Cemeteries are a highly regulated social function. Just a few of the legal requirements are fencing, demonstrated financial support, including a trust fund for maintenance, proper zoning, and a dedicated and demonstrated ability to manage what goes on in a cemetery. In the last year, about 800,000 people were buried in the conventional manner, embalmed and encased in a steel coffin in a concrete vault. The major option to this type of burial is cremation. The cremation rate in the United States has been increasing steadily, with the national average rising from 4% in 1960 to 48% today, almost 1 in 2. Why such a dramatic change? The American Cremation Association, which obviously is an interest group with a vested interest in cremation, claims that money is the big reason. The average cremation with a memorial service costs about $3,500, while the average traditional funeral costs about $9,000. Another influence on the cremation versus burial rate is the fact that families are more dispersed than in the past, making it harder to visit grave sites. Hence, the sense of place and connection that I discussed and showed in many of the slides simply is lacking in today's modern mobile society. You might think you know what cremation is, but I'm just going to give you a little technical information. The modern cremation process uses a furnace fueled by natural gas that reduces a human body to 46 pounds of residual atoms. The cremation process destroys all organic carbon-based matter, and all bodily fluids evaporate. Although cremated remains are commonly called ashes, they are not ashes. They are molecules of bone fragments that do not vaporize at the highest temperature of cremation, which is 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Over the years, several people have done things to memorialize the death of a loved one connected with this church. Lois Schnitzline had a light pole for her deceased husband. Marcia Jett has a window over in the old sanctuary. Several people planted trees with plaques that seem to have been lost. And the ashes of Art Friedman and Karen Peck's mother are buried outside. The spreading of ashes, or the burial of ashes, is not regulated by civil legal authorities. I think the fact that not many people know Art Friedman is back there is wrong. I really think we should do something to memorialize people who want their cremains put here in our church grounds. I deliberately didn't include pictures that I could have done about some churches have, a granite slab and you engrave names and dates. Some have brass plaques, but I honestly believe that this is something that we should do something about. If you agree, I invite you to contact me and see if we can initiate a discussion on this topic. Thank you. Now, I am going to introduce Laura Wildmartina, our member, who in turn is going to introduce our speaker for the special collection today.
Good Good morning. I'm Laura Wilmarth-Tyna. I have been a member here at DUC for a while now, and outside of my involvement here, I work at Lewis University down in Romeoville, and I work with a lot of community-based organizations. And so I'm really pleased today to have Kay Bolden, who works with the Warren Sharp Community Center. Don't tell anyone at work. Totally a favorite of mine. Wonderful organization that works in Joliet, serving the community there in really wonderful ways. So I'm going to invite Kay up to share a little bit with you about what Warren Sharp does, and I hope that you will give generously to their outstanding work.
Good morning. Thank you so much, not just to you, Laura, but to all of you for the warm welcome this morning. I appreciate it. Warren Sharp, since 1991, has been providing social services to low-income families and youth on the south side of Joliet. And those are the standard things you might always think of: after-school program, summer day camp, food pantry, teen parenting, gang diversion, all those things that kind of come under a community center. About 4 years ago, though, we did something we didn't think was very remarkable at the time. We planted some beans in a vacant lot. And as it turned out, they seemed to be magic beans, because today, 4 years later, we're growing fruit and vegetables and herbs on 4 vacant lots in Joliet in a food desert. And a food desert is an area that's defined as, for the people who live there are low income, have no transportation, and the nearest grocery store is a 4.5-mile walk. Yes, there are no grocery stores within 4.5 miles. The food desert where Warren Sharp is means that you can walk around my neighborhood and you can buy heroin, you can buy marijuana, you can buy stolen parts for your car, but you can't buy a bag of apples for your children. And so these 4 lots, which are growing every year, provide all the fresh food that there is to our food pantry, to the 40 kids who will be in the garden working tomorrow, and for the 600 families who depend on Warren Sharp's food pantry to be able to feed their children. Our garden does more than grow food, though. I call myself an accidental farmer, because it was all quite by accident that we learn to use the garden, not just to provide fresh food, but also to teach the kids about plants, to unplug them from their computer games and their video games and get them outside, to teach them about the growing traditions of other cultures and the spiritual traditions of other cultures, because food is our universal language. We grow beets like the European immigrants did during the World War. We grow corn and beans and squash together, as did the indigenous people in Illinois. Last year we grew cotton in our slave patch, so we could see how easy it's not to pick cotton, even for a little while. So all these people depend on the center, but they're taking ownership of their neighborhood. They're taking the change in their own hands, and that's the whole point of growing things, and that's the whole point of the magic beans. They depend on us, and we depend on the kindness of strangers. So thank you all very much for having me. Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much.
Our stewards would assist and come forward, and Bonnie. No. Oh, I thank you for that. Very good. Please, if you are going to pay by check, in the attention line, indicate that it is for the Warren Sharp Community Center. Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. Before we stand for our closing hymn, number 324, I want to thank Bonnie for picking the theme-appropriate music for today's service. If you would please join me in 324. Edna St. Vincent Millay. Into the darkness they go, the wise and the lovely. Crowned with lilies and with laurel they go, but I am not resigned. Lovers and thinkers, into the earth with you. Be one with the dull, the indiscriminate dust. A fragment of what you felt, of what you knew, a formula, a phrase remains, but the best is lost. Down, down, down into the darkness of the grave, gently they go, the beautiful, the tender, the kind. Quietly they go, the intelligent, the witty, the brave. I know, but I do not approve. I will now extinguish our chalice and invite you to greet one another, and the topic of discussion is, could the church do something more elegant and lasting with the cremains? Thank you for coming today.